The moment the knife flashed, under the flickering bus lights, every breath inside the crowded Chicago bus seemed to freeze because two thugs had finally crossed a line they could never uncross, and they had no idea that the quiet man they were cornering was a highly trained U.S. Army officer who had survived combat zones far more dangerous than this moving metal box on wheels. The taller thug leaned in close, his hoodie shadowing his face, his voice low and cruel as he mocked the silence of the man sitting by the window, while the second one laughed and shoved a shaking nurse who had been standing nearby, using fear like entertainment, feeding off the helplessness of strangers who were too scared to intervene. Then the shorter thug made the mistake that changed everything, lifting his boot and kicking the German shepherd lying calmly at the man's feet as if the dog were nothing more than an obstacle. Before we begin, don't forget to hit like, repost, or share and subscribe. And I'm really curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Back to the story. The bus jolted as the shepherd sprang up, not barking, not lunging, but locking its sharp amber eyes on its handler, waiting, disciplined, controlled, trained for moments exactly like this. The man slowly raised his head, and when he looked at them, the noise of the bus seemed to fade because they were something in his eyes that didn't belong to a civilian, something cold, measured, and terrifyingly focused. His name was Mason Carter, 34 years old, active duty, U.S. Army officer on emergency leave, a man who had led soldiers through ambushes overseas and carried wounded friends through gunfire, and yet here he sat in worn civilian clothes, silent, almost invisible until now. The scar near his jaw tightened as he stood, moving with calm precision, placing himself between the thugs and the terrified passengers without raising his voice, without making threats, because men like Mason never needed to step back. He said quietly, his tone flat but final as his hand rested gently on the shepherd's collar, grounding the dog, while every instinct in the animal screamed readiness. The taller thug laughed, flashing the blade closer to Mason's chest, unaware that the distance he'd closed was exactly the distance Mason trained for, the distance where fights ended in seconds. When the thug lunged, Mason moved, twisting the wrist, redirecting the blade, using the narrow bezel to his advantage, his body reacting faster than thought, faster than fear, while the shepherd held position, teeth bared, eyes locked, a silent weapon waiting for command. The second thug tried to flee, shoving passengers aside, but Mason hooked his arm, drove him down, and pinned him to the floor with controlled force. Not rage, not anger, just efficiency. By the time the bus screeched to a stop, both men were on the ground, disarmed, groaning, and the silence inside the bus was broken only by shaking breaths and the quiet whine of the shepherd as Mason finally knelt and checked him for injury. What Mason didn't know yet was that these two weren't just street bullies, and that this small act of justice on a freezing Chicago afternoon was about to pull him into something far darker, far more dangerous, and impossible to walk away from. Police lights washed the inside of the bus in pulsing red and blue, and as officers dragged the two groaning men down the steps. Mason felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the quiet warning instinct that had kept him alive in places where mistakes got people buried. The other passengers stared at him, differently now, not with fear but with awe and gratitude, especially the nurse, whose hands still trembled as she whispered, "Thank you," her voice cracking when she looked at the German shepherd sitting protectively at Mason's side. Mason nodded at once, offering nothing more, because praise never sat right with him, not after everything he'd seen. And as the bus finally emptied, one of the responding officers paused, his radio crackling softly as he studied Mason's posture, the dog's discipline, the way both of them scanned the surroundings without even realizing they were doing it. "Army?" the officer asked quietly. Mason hesitated, then answered with a short nod, already knowing this moment wouldn't end cleanly. Minutes later, detectives arrived and the story began to unravel, because the two men he'd taken down weren't just random thugs, but connected to a violent robbery ring that had been terrorizing parts of the city, a group known for knives, guns, and revenge against anyone who crossed them. When Mason's name ran through the system, alarms rang quietly behind closed doors. Flags tied to his service record, his leadership history, his classified deployments. And before he could even leave the scene, an unmarked SUV rolled up beside the curb. A man in a dark coat stepped out, flashing federal credentials, his eyes sharp with urgency, as he told Mason that this incident had just made him a target. That night, Mason didn't sleep. He sat on his brother's couch, city lights bleeding through the window, the German shepherd lying at his feet, ears twitching at every distant sound. He knew the look in those thugs' eyes before they went down, the promise of retaliation. And when his phone buzzed just before dawn with an unknown number, he answered without hesitation. "They know who you are," the voice said, "and they're coming." The next 24 hours were a blur of movement, planning, and quiet preparation. Mason slipping back into the mindset he thought he'd left behind, securing his surroundings, mapping exits, trusting the dog with his life, the same way he had overseas. When the attack came, it was fast and brutal. A failed ambush that ended with sirens, arrests, and the collapse of the entire ring. Thanks to evidence pulled from the men Mason stopped on that bus. Days later, as the city breathed easier, Mason stood at another bus stop, winter sun breaking through the clouds, the German shepherd sitting calmly beside him once again. He wasn't looking for trouble, never was, but Chicago had learned something that day, that strength doesn't always announce itself, that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and that sometimes the quiet man and his loyal dog are exactly the ones you should never underestimate. This story touched millions of hearts. Did it touch yours? Let us know with a like, comment, yes, and subscribe or follow for more amazing stories like